We've talked about the so-called regressive left with you in the past, and one of the primary critiques of this concept is that it's just a pretense to criticize Islam or feminism and things like university safe spaces. And there's no doubt that those examples do come up, but in reality, the concept is an attempt to illustrate a larger authoritarian tendency among some on the left. To some, the term regressive left has become totally toxic and worthless, and I totally get that. So we can even set aside the term and talk about authoritarian leftism instead. The bigger picture is the phenomenon of supposed progressives using right-wing means of communicating and controlling people, and how left-wing authoritarianism is very distinct from real progressivism. It's not progressive to use right-wing means like censorship and us versus them rhetoric to neutralize bad ideas or promote progressivism. Using authoritarianism to enforce progressivism is a sort of paradox. Authoritarian leftists act as though the end result justify any means. If someone is, quote, progressive, they're automatically and morally and rationally in the clear and entitled to use whatever methods they deem necessary to advance their goals. These authoritarians use the progressive brand as a sort of facade to attract people who have an inclination towards progressivism, like the inherent values of benevolence and self-consciousness, and they use their supposed monopoly on progressivism to enforce their agendas. But many people are ending up being blind to this process because they're caught up in the righteousness that they feel from their association with a centralized set of beliefs and tactics. This defies the values of individualism, which is basic to progressivism, the idea of upholding personal independence and free agency. To that point, one of the most prevalent and innate facets of the authoritarian left is identity politics. It's also a foundational precursor for a lot of other manifestations of authoritarians on the left.
Just remember, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other.
Let's be clear that simply acknowledging the shared experiences and struggles between people of a certain group, like, say, the LGBT community or a certain ethnicity, in itself is helpful to positive social change. But here, what I'm referring to as identity politics is when this idea is twisted or taken to irrational lengths. Black Lives Matter is a movement that I completely support in almost all of its goals. It has ideas and missions with which I'm 100% on board because racism in America is present and thriving. Black and Latino people are far more likely to be pulled over by police, searched by police, more likely to be arrested, and they're more likely to be killed by police. And even if they're not killed, they're also more likely to be convicted than any other ethnic group, and they receive harsher sentences. But occasionally, there have been individual instances in which I've questioned some methods and tactics of those demonstrating under the Black Lives Matter umbrella. Some opponents of Black Lives Matter use these situations to characterize the entire movement, but I don't. There have just been some times where protesters made questionable moves in promoting their cause, such as this exhibition in a quiet Dartmouth library.
Black lives matter! 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 Do you think Black lives matter? Black lives matter! Black lives matter!
Or when two women contentiously took control of a Seattle, Washington Bernie Sanders rally.
Thank you, Seattle, for being one of the most progressive cities in the United States of America.
If you do not listen to her, your event will be shut down right now.
Bernie Sanders has been arrested during segregation protests. He supported Jesse Jackson's 1988 presidential campaign, in spite of Jesse Jackson's history of questionable comments about Jews, which is another story altogether. He has a long history of supporting welfare accessibility, voting rights, police reform, prison reform, and he has a 97% rating from the NAACP. Social and economic equality have explicitly and implicitly been the cornerstones of Bernie's career and of his 2016 presidential campaign. Some Sanders supporters in the crowd were vocally displeased with the two women's decisions to confiscate the stage. The women went on to yell at the crowd and call them white racists.
We are trying to be reasonable. We are trying. We're going to let you on the mic.
I will speak when everyone is ready. I'll wait. You guys are full of bull with your Black Lives Matter. Listen, you're never going to hear Bernie speak unless I hear it silent here now. We are going to have a moment of silence for Mike Brown for 4.5 minutes.
The illustration here of what makes identity politics so unreasonable is the bizarre, hostile reaction that some people have to those who question the productiveness of these women taking over a Bernie Sanders rally. Many people, black and white, react to these critiques with more accusations of racism. They'll say that if I disagree with any tactics by a movement like this, I'm less committed to the cause, or I'm not recognizing how truly marginalized they are. In fact, I was called a white supremacist after some comments I made about Black Lives Matter, at no point leaving in doubt my total support for the broader mission. There will be people who essentially say, if I don't have the same experiences as a group that is seeking social justice, then I have nothing valid to say about the strategies of two individual women, and that I must therefore appreciate and applaud anything they do. This kind of absolutism plainly defies the progressive notions of free thought and open debate.
Yeah, my name is Marissa Johnson, and I grew up with Tea Party parents, and I no longer believe that anymore. People are trying to go after my personal character and just derail and derail and derail. And that signals to me that the things that I said were spot on.
And perhaps some of the derailment, as you describe, was partly because of the tactic that was used.
Maybe you don't agree with my thoughts about the Bernie rally or the scene at the Dartmouth Library. Maybe I'm wrong and these events benefited the Black Lives Matter movement in some way I just can't see. But you should at least refrain from discounting my thoughts about political strategy based on my appearing to be white, and whether I am or not is a whole other point of debate. And you should recognize that a credible perspective can come from someone not necessarily belonging to the group that is fighting for justice, especially if that person is an avid supporter of the movement like myself. Otherwise, you're simply shutting down discourse in the interest of identity politics. Let's look at an analogy involving Donald Trump. As we've discussed, Trump's base consists significantly of people with less education and lower income, and those people suffer from the real problems in our economic system, problems that need to be fixed. And so the solution that they propose is to elect Trump and demonize Mexicans and Muslims, which are obvious missteps towards forwarding economic equality. But would you say that a wealthy, educated liberal is not entitled to acknowledge the fallacies of low-income Trump supporters because rich people just don't understand what it's like to be poor, and that therefore a Trump presidency must be the correct answer to wealth inequality problems? Of course not, because economically disadvantaged people are individuals and wealthy people are individuals, and the merits of an idea are independent from however we might organize society into identity groups. This is why we have discussions about morality and politics to begin with, because absolute questions of right and wrong or honest discussions about the pragmatics of achieving justice should exist separately from people's emotional impulses or biases, including the tribalism and groupthink of identity politics. It detracts and distracts us from the empiricism and critical thinking that should be the basis of our analysis of any topic. Critical thinking, distinguishing good arguments from bad. Is an argument bad because of the identity of the person making it? The entire meme is akin to irrational populism and people having blind devotion to a political party. When we're talking about identity politics, whether it's ethnicities, religions, or any marginalized group, an important part of maintaining the narrative is through reinforcing the idea of victimhood. And many on the left act as if there's a sort of hierarchy of marginalization, that minorities and oppressed factions of society are somehow ranked according to our obligation to defend them. This also detracts from intellectual inspections of ideas and debates. Sometimes it's enforcing overbearing political correctness or demanding that people use special language. Authoritarian leftists often act as though they should be able to live in a world free from being questioned or offended, so they seek control over those around them, as well as the entire social atmosphere, by calling anyone who disagrees with them a bigot or a conservative or immoral. This is enforced by doing something else that's central to authoritarianism: obstructing freedom of expression or condemning certain speech in order to try to control culture and discourse. Twitter and Facebook have been known to silence conservatives in some instances. Twitter has actually even seen recent blows to their business that some speculate to be associated with this phenomenon, with unprecedented stock value plummeting and loss of usership. Many individual users on social media also employ similar practices, as we see, for example, a lot of radical proponents of social justice disabling comment sections on sites like YouTube in order to inhibit speech that doesn't reinforce their narratives. Democrats in government also have a history of trying to shape culture according to their social values and narratives by curbing free speech, from vilifying video game developers.
The ability of our children to access pornographic and violent material on an M-rated video game is spiraling out of control.
To censoring music.
We have always talked about the positive aspects of the music industry, but of course the highlight has been on the excesses that have been allowed to develop as we have tried to focus our concern on those excesses.
An inherent part of being authoritarian is silencing voices of opposition, as well as using media or hindering media to serve goals of molding society into what they want it to be. The best means of defeating right-wing ideas is to let them have a venue, to argue against them and expose them for how bad they are, not to employ right-wing tactics by trying to control conversations and zeitgeists. There have been far too many good examples throughout history and today of what this sort of left-wing authoritarianism can lead to if left unchecked. During the Cold War, many American leftists turned a blind eye to countless human rights abuses around the world simply because they were performed by ostensibly left-wing socialist governments. This includes genocide in Cambodia, any number of Chinese abuses of power, poverty and attacks on civil liberties in Cuba, a list of crimes against humanity in the Soviet Union. Throughout the 20th century, leftists in capitalist countries all over the world were apologists for governments like these because of their pretense of being socialist egalitarian states. Not only did left-wing authoritarianism grow to overwhelming and destructive degrees in these places, leftists in the West pretended, or were under false impressions, that these crises were benign because of identity politics, loyalty to labels like socialism, and often a fanatical desire to denounce the West and capitalism. Today, the habit of some leftists to oppose the U.S. and its allies at whatever cost of rationality can be seen in their pledge to deny or at least downplay the harmfulness of some authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. For instance, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the standard impulse by Western leftists is to adamantly and relentlessly point out the wrongdoings of Israel against Palestinians, many of which are legitimate, that I agree with. I've criticized Israel many times on the show. Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing government must go, as it's beholden to extremist reactionary politics and his alliances with the religious right elements of the government. I condemn Israeli settlements unconditionally. But there's a general habit among a large part of the left of rigidly asserting that progressives should unconditionally support Palestinians and chastise Israel without any nuance. Anyone who reasonably diverts from that paradigm often gets labeled as right-wing, and this is the type of otherizing that I've been talking about that's intrinsic to the authoritarian left, as well as the act of pretending that there are simple answers to extremely complex problems, refusing to have dynamic and refined positions, hostility versus thoughtful considerations and debate. Many act as though it's left-wing apostasy to acknowledge certain real phenomena among Palestinians, like misogyny, brutal and dogmatic anti-Semitism, clerical fascism, as well as certain realities about Israel, such as the legal establishment of the state, the fact that Jews have been living and migrating there for centuries, and the peace and territory proposals by Israel that have been rejected countless times by Palestinian authorities. Some on the left even go as far as becoming apologists for Hamas, ready to rationalize just about anything that Hamas does, no matter how heinous, even things that Israel has never been known to do. Hamas forces its population to stockpile weapons and accommodate terrorists inside mosques, hospitals, and United Nations aid buildings. They have a consistent record of declining and violating ceasefires, as well as using Palestinian civilians as human shields during Israeli counterattacks. They've deprived their people of basic freedoms like speech, press, and assembly, using brutal intimidation to deter dissent and protest, as well as diligently and often violently working to censor the reporting of any of these crimes. Venezuela is another modern example of the left's sometimes blind commitment to assail the United States. Leftists and socialists all over the West have praised Hugo Chavez, as well as the new and similar Maduro government, as exemplars of progressive leadership, simply for the sake of tribalistically remaining aligned with anti-American sentiment and what they mistake for progressive populism. Hugo Chavez was nothing close to an upholder of liberal values. His administration was massively corrupt by almost all valid measures. The 2008 Corruptions Perceptions Index by Transparency International ranked Venezuela as the 22nd most corrupt country in the world. Chavez and his inner circle were notorious for secrecy, bribery, cronyism, and giving impunity to government officials. Since Chavez's time in power, police corruption and parliamentary corruption have exploded in Venezuela. He hugely diminished Venezuela's checks and balances between different areas of government. He took control of the courts, he took control of the National Electoral Council, and he tried to change the constitution so that he'd be eligible for unlimited re-elections. Chavez also supported FARC terrorists in Colombia until it no longer suited his political interests. He vilified Jews. His government used violence against protesters and denied them due legal process, and he expelled workers with Human Rights Watch from the country for reporting on the corruption. And just between 2011 and 2014, over 31,000 complaints of human rights violations in Venezuela were reported to the United Nations. Only 3% of them resulted in indictments by the Venezuelan government. Not only is Venezuela an example of the left's apologetics for authoritarianism, it's an example of that into which American left-wing authoritarianism could hypothetically evolve if we accept censorship, social conditioning, and moral and intellectual elitism. Leftists are often willing to overlook these sorts of illiberalisms in the name of, quote, egalitarianism, and the American authoritarian left embodies many of these Chavez-like traits in milder ways. To be clear, my sense is that the leftists in places like the US who have authoritarian habits are probably well-meaning. Many are truly progressive, and they're just swept up by authoritarianism's inherent tendency to create this sort of in-crowd that I mentioned. They do this by creating norms in education and conversations that reinforce this political correctness and victimhood. Right-wing authoritarianism is often rooted in religion, often disguised as so-called family values, and upholding capitalism and the Constitution, also reminiscent of religions to many on the right. American left-wing authoritarianism, on the other hand, is more rooted in emotion, absolutism, and the resulting narrow tunnel vision used in defending and promoting their causes, even if it means ignoring certain realities and progressive principles. The only thing that gives power to this new alt-right movement, which entails cultural libertarianism and a lot of anti-social justice warrior sentiment, is the left's momentum with these habits that we're talking about. People who are otherwise very left-leaning on many or most issues are feeling sort of obligated to call themselves conservatives or at minimum moderates because they don't want to identify with this aggression and ideological puritanism that is often manifesting on the left. It's what we should expect from people on the right, people like Donald Trump. It's the right's job to tell people how to think how to speak and behave, to act like martyrs, constantly victimized by their opponents. It's the job of people like right-wing radio hosts who have long played their audience's fears by reinforcing victim narratives and the idea that everyone is out to get them and that they should just completely shut out anybody who disagrees with them. Authoritarian leftists are often relying less on facts and controversies to inform their rhetoric, and instead falling back on this otherization of anyone who opposes them, this mentality of you're either for us or against us. That is not what progressivism represents.